Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. I always say I'm excited, but this one I'm actually truly excited about. It's one of my passions that we're going to be talking about, and I've got the lovely Beth with me. Beth, who have we got on today?
Hello, Alina. So today we've got Kate Green, who is an equestrian journalist and writer, who has written 12 books, including The Little Book of Burley and on the autobiographies for Mark Todd, Pippa Fernell and Mary King. She's also the deputy editor for Country Life, and she is here to talk about her newest book, Badminton Horse Trials at 75. Hi, Kate.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm bouncing off the walls because we're going to be talking all things horsey, and I am a former horsey girl, and I've got some geeky questions, but we'll ask them towards the end because I don't want to start off with all the geeky stuff. But some of our listeners might not actually know what we're talking about, because when you think of badminton, to do with the rackets and the little cockles and whatever they're called. But that's not what this is all about. What are badminton horse trials? Can you explain for our listeners so they understand it a little bit better?
Badminton Horse Trials, it's a bit like the Wimbledon of the sport of horse trials. So horse trials has been an Olympic sport since 1912, and it comprises three phases. So riders and horses together do a dressage test, which is a test of obedience and submission and sort of beauty and harmony and paces. And that is marked subjectively, a bit like ice skating. Then the pivotal part of the whole competition, and this is what makes it distinct, is the cross-country phase. And at badminton, which is the top level of the sport, they do about 4 miles of galloping over solid fences, including water and combination fences and great big brush fences and drops. And it's all quite sort of dramatic, and it's a huge test of the confidence that horse and rider have between each other, and it's against the clock. So that's the pivotal part of the day. And then the third phase is a show jumping phase, which is probably more familiar to most people. That's the sort of bit you tend to see on television, and everybody thinks that most riders are show jumpers. And that's over the coloured fences, and they are knocked down, and that's pretty straightforward. You get penalised for knocking a fence down. And then the overall idea is that you end on the lowest score possible. The rider with the lowest score wins. And so badminton is considered the pinnacle of the sport internationally. It's an international event. It's also the oldest horse trials in the world, and it's the richest. It's got the biggest prize money. This year, the winning rider will take home £117,000 and 500. So it's worth doing. It's a big thing.
Just for chits and giggles here, you're a rider, you've ridden, obviously. Out of all three, what's your favourite?
Of the three disciplines, of the three phases, definitely the cross country. That's what it's all about. Cross country day is just a really big day. It's very exciting. Cross country day at badminton has more than 100,000 spectators. It's probably the biggest day spectator sport, biggest single day spectator sport in the world, bigger than anything with a sort of arena, because it's all set in this beautiful parkland owned by the Duke of Beaufort in Gloucestershire.
Beth, do you have a favourite discipline?
I have to say the dressage, I guess. I think that's the one I've been most familiar with at the competitions, like the Olympics that you see on TV. So yeah, I'd say that some of the routines are very beautiful. So yeah, that's what I'd go with.
I embarrassed myself at dressage, so that is not my favourite discipline. I think cross country, never done it, like to try it. But show jumping, obviously not that high because I'm not that good. But horse jumping for me was probably the most fun, and not the most fun when you fall on your ass. So
it happens to the best of us.
Well, I mean, as a history podcast, we've got to just go in straight with the history now. So, Kate, can you tell us about how badminton actually began?
So the catalyst for Badminton Horse Trials was the 1948 Olympic Games. They were on home territory. It was the London Olympics, post-war Olympics, which they did incredibly well to run because it was a country devastated by the Second World War, and it was definitely all on a budget. And horse trials had never happened in this country before. It was very much a continental sport. And Britain had never fielded a team either in this discipline. But anyway, they did. And the Olympic eventing was held at Tweaseldown in Hampshire, and the cross-country course was at Camberley. And the Duke of Beaufort happened to be in the audience. He was there having a picnic on cross-country day, along with numerous other curious and fascinated spectators who had never seen this cross-country sport before. And the British team were expected to do pretty well. I mean, we are a nation of horsemen. We have a great tradition of hunting and riding across country. And it was anticipated that, we would do quite well in this. And we didn't. We finished absolutely nowhere. And the French won, and the other continental nations were absolutely all over it. And Britain was sort of quite suspicious of the art of dressage in those days. They thought it was some sort of strange, rather sort of poncy continental activity. And so we weren't very good at that either. And the Duke, upon watching this, realised that he needed to provide a training ground so that we could train future teams to not disgrace and embarrass themselves at future Olympic Games. And he had the foresight to see that this was a sport that Britain should be good at with the right preparation, the right training. And so he suggested that he would host a similar competition at Badminton in 1949. And that is how it all started. So here we are 75 years later.
I've got to tell you, I'm actually a little bit surprised. I mean, I know what the Badminton Horse Trials are in the modern terms, but not the history of it. And the moment you said that we didn't trust this whole dressage idea, it's a bit mind-blowing because I actually thought that the British would have invented it for some strange reason.
No, far from it. It was very much a continental thing. And so nations like France and Germany and the Swedish were very advanced in the overall sport of horse trials back in the early days. And it was the whole concept of a horse trials was started by cavalry officers as a good way of training their chargers for war, because they were going to teach them the obedience of the dressage and the bravery and the fitness of the cross country, and then the accuracy of the show jumping. Because the whole idea of the third show jumping phase is that you have conserved the energy of your horse so that it can be accurate and supple and obedient on the third day after the exertions of the cross-country day. It's only really latterly that Britain has become really very good. I mean, we are an absolute world force in the sport of pure dressage, and we hold many memories. We won the gold medal, double gold at the London Olympic Games. But before that, Britain was very much and also ran in the sport of pure dressage.
And with the horse trials in their infancy, just in the sense of Britain starting to participate in them, you imagine in those early days a bit of a trial and error for them, just trying, as you say, in the first competition, they weren't that great. How did it change throughout the 1950s as I guess they were trying to really grapple with it and improve?
Well, it all became sort of more professional as the years went on, and it was remarkable how quickly a calendar of events sprang up in Britain, and many of them were also at the sort of great country houses and in the beautiful parklands, places like Harwood in North Yorkshire, and then much later Burley in Lincolnshire, but many, many other sort of big houses as well. And it was extraordinary how this calendar sprang up, and it's a calendar that has become very much the envy of the world. And this is why so many overseas riders come and base themselves in Britain, because it is such a full calendar and such a sort of good preparation for international championships. But yes, in those early days, it was all very much thrown together, and there was, the sort of things like cross-country timing and stopwatches were nothing like as slick as they are now today. In fact, after the first Badminton Horse Trials, it took them all night after cross-country to come up with the results. And the course wasn't roped, so spectators were sort of wandering gaily at will across the course, and causing obstructions. And one rider, I think, got caught up with a dog lead. And riders who were sort of particularly canny, and this went on into the 1950s, they could find shortcuts across, car parks and all sorts of things, and cut corners. So it took the 1950s really for the sport to become sort of much more formalized. But I think what people also don't realize is that the rules have stayed pretty similar for international horse trials ever since. And the dimensions of the fences, although nowadays they may look sort of much bigger, much more solid timber, but the dimensions have not changed very much since 1949. It was in the 1960s, really, that changes began to take place within the sport.
So that brings us really quite nicely to Frank Weldon, because he's quite important within your narrative, isn't he? So tell us a little bit about who he was and what did he do?
Colonel Frank Weldon can probably be credited as the man who saved Badminton Horse Trials, really, because he was an army officer, he was a competitor, he won it twice himself in the 1950s. He had a great horse called Kilbarry, and they were the combination to beat. They were very dashing. And he was also a member of the first British Olympic team to bring back a gold medal to Britain. He won team gold in Stockholm in 1956. And he then became, during the 1960s, he became the course designer, and then he became the director. So the horse trials was already flourishing in the 60s. They had got a title sponsor, Whitbread, in 1961. Whitbread stayed with Badminton as title sponsor for 30 years. That's an extraordinary loyalty in the world of sporting sponsorships. And Frank took over in sort of mid-1960s as course designer, and then he became director. And he very much took the event by the sort of scruff of its neck, because there was a certain sort of lukewarm feeling towards whether it was all going to continue. The British team went through a sort of slightly fallow period, didn't win many medals, and it undeniably left a terrible mess in the Duke's beautiful parkland. It was held in April, it was often wet, and all those spectators, and because the spectator attendance grew incredibly rapidly. So it did leave a bit of a mess, and Frank turned it into much more of a commercial enterprise, and he persuaded the Duke and everybody else in the hierarchy of horse trials that this was really a jewel in the crown, and it was something to be kept going. And he had a great understanding ahead of his time of the press, the media. He was a reporter himself, and he got television into Badminton, and the BBC has been there ever since, showing all the action. And he understood about spectator comfort. He understood that you need far more loos, that you need to organise the car parking and the traffic and the seating and the viewing. But above all, he was a great, bold cross-country course designer, and he got lots of his ideas from overseas championships. He travelled widely, he brought ideas back and he adapted them. And the great fences that he designed in those 1960s are what gave Badminton its kind of mythical status. And some of those fences are still there today. There is always a complex of fences along this ditch. It's called the Vicarage Ditch at the far end of the cross-country course. And those fences still require you to be very brave and very accurate. And he had all sorts of fences, like he had a Normandy bank that he got the idea from a French championships, and that was a bank where you literally leapt into space and it's created some wonderful photographs of the past. And there was a ski jump where you came down this precipitous bank, and there was a rail at the bottom, so you had to be in control coming down this bank in order to hook your horse up over the rails at the bottom. And the lake, of course, was always, that took on sort of legendary status, and it still does, because there's huge crowds around it now. And so you are galloping into this wall of sound, and you know that the crowd there's a little bit of them that would quite like to see one or two people harmlessly fall off in the drink. And it usually happens. And those are always the pictures that are remembered. They're always the pictures that make it into the paper. So what Frank Weldon did was to create this sort of legend around badminton. And he was quite he used to be quite brusque in his competitor briefings, and he made it very clear that riders were jolly lucky to be there. And as a result, badminton that is why it is the Wimbledon of the sport. That is why it is the great event that everybody aims to get to. Everyone longs to get their horse there. They talk about, just as in racing, you talk about whether you've got a Grand National horse. In eventing, you talk about whether you have a badminton horse.
So the 1970s have been described as a golden age for badminton. Why exactly was that?
This had a lot to do with the fact that Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, was competing at the very top level, and her parents, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, followed her progress tremendously. The Queen was a great friend of the 10th Duke of Beaufort, and so she used to come to badminton anyway. She came to her first badminton just before her coronation in 1952 and presented the prizes and was part of the house party. So there was always a certain amount of glamour, and the royal family, large party of royal family, would sit on the hay wagon on the cross-country course watching all the action. They would mingle with the crowds. The Queen once picked up somebody's whip when they dropped it. But all this took on an added dimension in the 1970s when the princess began competing. And in 1971, she won the European Championships. She was, I think, only 21, and she won it on her horse Doublet, who was bred by the Queen. And she competed at badminton on Doublet, and she competed on Doublet on a horse called Goodwill. And she was placed a few times, and she was the first member of the royal family to compete in Olympic Games in 1976. So there was all of that. And she was also engaged and then married Captain Mark Phillips, and he was an extremely glamorous army officer and a beautiful horseman. And so there was quite a lot of magic around that. He won badminton 4 times, 3 of them in the 1970s, once on the Queen's horse Columbus. So the Queen presented the trophy to her own son-in-law. And also Richard Meade was a major member of the eventing community in those days. He was the most successful Olympic rider of them all, and he was the individual Olympic gold medalist in 1972 at Munich, and he was a top sportsman in his own right. So the eventing, horse trials, became known as a sport in which the royal family participated. It was considered glamorous. The participants were brave and courageous. There was plenty of drama, there was plenty of glamour, and we won lots of medals in it. Britain led the world in the 1970s.
Out of curiosity, apart from Princess Anne, are there any other royals that took part in the badminton trials?
Yes, her daughter, Zara Phillips, Zara Tyndall, has competed at badminton, and she also competed at an Olympic Games, and she won a team silver medal in 2012 in London. She was also the world and European champion on her best horse Toy Town back in 2005-2006. So huge media interest has surrounded that. And like her mother, she has risen above the sort of inevitable attention with tremendous grace, because there you are doing your dressage test or warming up, and the clicking of cameras is absolutely deafening. And of course, the press all crowd round you afterwards to ask how it went. And it didn't necessarily go that well, but you've got to be very gracious. And mother and daughter have both contributed enormously to the profile of the sport, as has Mark Phillips.
Absolutely. And we're going to carry on our little jump through the various eras of badminton to cover all the key events. What was going on in the 1980s? Was it still very much a success story? And, that Britain was still getting those medals, doing well. Were there any changes made to the course or anything else of badminton at that time?
The 1980s was a very successful time for eventing. I mean, these were the sort of booming Thatcherite era, so there was masses of sponsorship. There was plenty of money. I mean, a number of top riders had their own title sponsors. Frank Weldon was still at the helm and still presenting badminton as a really prestigious competition that all riders should aim for. And it was in the 1980s that Frank finally retired, and on a high note, because the horse trials had become something that everybody really wanted to win. It was a big entry each year, and they would run sort of 80 top riders, and it was starting to become more international. So in 1980, a young New Zealand farmer called Mark Todd came over. He'd always wanted to ride at badminton. He'd seen it on telly. He'd seen the pictures. He was very enthralled by it. And he came over, and at his very first attempt, he won. And in fact, the course was jumping. It was a very challenging cross-country course that year. And the lady who was helping him in the warm-up, she really didn't like to tell him that actually, people were falling off all over the place. Somebody had broken their leg. There were no clear rounds. So he set off with sort of wonderful ignorance is bliss of the young rider at their first badminton, and he came home and he won the competition. And the commentator, the BBC commentator, Raymond Brooks Ward, was so surprised that he was convinced that Lucinda Green, who was the absolute queen of badminton and had won it several times by then, he was convinced she had won it, and he hadn't noticed that her horse had dropped a foot in the water in the final show jumping phase. And he said, "Oh, it's another win for Lucinda." "Oh, no, it's not. It's that New Zealander, Mark Todd." And so everybody was very startled. But Mark remembers that everyone very much took him to their hearts. They cheered, and the badminton audience has always been like that. They have always given a tremendous ovation to the winner, no matter what nation they're from, no matter whether a homegrown star has just, blown it and somebody from overseas has won it. And it has always set a very good sort of atmosphere and a great welcome to all nations and all winners, and their achievement has always been really recognised. But that Mark Todd's victory was the start, really, of badminton becoming truly international. And in the late 1980s, Frank retired and Hugh Thomas took over. And Hugh had been, he was the combination of a horseman and a businessman, which is what was really required for badminton, because you had to know what you were doing. Course designing, Hugh had designed the cross-country course for the 1988 Olympic eventing competition in Seoul. And he had ridden at the very highest level. He had been to the Olympics. He'd been a runner-up at badminton. He was also, like Frank, he was highly intelligent and very articulate and had a very good business head on him. And he carried badminton through for another 30 years. And that really was an achievement, to keep the event at the top of the game for 30 years and into the 21st century.
The 1990s actually have a massive rise in non-British participants, doesn't it? So even though we have someone from New Zealand, so Mark Todd, we've got a rise in other nations.
Yes, the Australians were very dominant during the 1990s, as were the New Zealanders. So Mark Todd's example of flying across the world, giving up everything, selling everything in order to come here. It was a great sacrifice away from your family. But it sort of set the trend for other Antipodean riders to come over. And so, yes, there were several international winners during the 1990s. Bruce Davidson, who was a long-time leading American rider, he won it in 1995. He'd been trying to do that for 23 years. He first came to Badminton on his honeymoon. And Mark Todd won twice more in the 1990s, and he also made history by completing the cross-country course with only one stirrup. That happened in 95. His stirrup bust as he was going cross-country, and you don't want to go around the Badminton cross-country course with only one stirrup. And he recalls that he was virtually laughing as, there he was galloping towards the lake with only one stirrup. Anyway, somehow he got home, and that was one of the great badminton legends. And the year before, he had won on a horse that he had never sat on before. So he took the ride on a horse called Horton Point, whose usual rider, Lynn Bevan, had bust her collarbone. And he was a very precious family horse, Horton Point. He was known as Sid, and his family adored him. And there was only one rider they could contemplate allowing to get on him, and that was Mark. And he was drawn first to go. So imagine being drawn number one in the order on a horse you've never sat on before. But anyway, he won. So that was another badminton legend. And we also had, in the 1990s, we had another American winner, David O'Connor. He went on to win the Olympic gold medal in Sydney in 2000. Badminton was very much considered an event you needed to go to before you went to the Olympics. And missing badminton because you thought you'd got your Olympic slot was always a bit of a risk, because somebody could come along and put up a brilliant performance and then you'd lose your place, because badminton form pretty much in those days pretty much took precedence over anything else to get your place at an Olympics.
I just Googled the photographs of Mark Todd riding with one stirrup, and wow. I mean, I can't imagine having your stirrups just wrong for you is uncomfortable, let alone having one. I can't imagine how he did this. He's got to be some sort of superhero.
He definitely was. And there's more to come with his story, because we'll get to that, but he came back out of retirement with extraordinary results.
We always love a out of retirement, back to the sports story. If it goes well, we always love that. I mean, the 2000s, what have been some of the key changes in that time over the last, 20 years or so? I imagine as well, with such an event with such longevity, obviously it's very important to attract new audiences, as well as those who have enjoyed the sport for many years. I mean, I guess as well, how have they managed to maintain and bring in new audiences? And what have the key events been of the 2000s for badminton?
Badminton certainly managed to retain its magic as the turn of the century came. But with it came, quite a lot of sort of modern day sensibilities. So the whole concept of sort of safety was much more to the forefront. There had been some bad accidents in the 1990s and some dark days. And so safety was very much at the forefront, and horse welfare. And so various changes were made to fence design and to timings. And then, but the seismic change, which came in the early part of the century, was the decision to do away with the extra cross-country phases, the extra endurance phases that were part of cross-country day. So in the old days, riders used to complete a roads and tracks phase, and then they did a steeplechase course. Then they did another roads and tracks phase. I mean, it seems extraordinary now. It's such a long time ago. Many people have no concept that all of those logistics went on, and all of that happened before they went across country. So it was about 40 miles in all, and you had to have a very fit horse. But when the Olympics came to Greece in 2004, the area set aside for the 3-day event was really tiny. It was sort of, the cross-country course was just like an airstrip. It was literally a strip of green grass surrounded by rocks near the coast out of Athens. And there was also a very small amount of warm-up room. And so the whole thing had to be adjusted. And it was sort of realised that the whole paraphernalia of putting on the old-fashioned endurance day was just too much for many nations. It was too expensive. You needed too much land. You needed an absolute army of volunteers to man all those extra checkpoints and extra phases. And so the decision was made that the Olympic competition would be just purely the cross-country phase, and it would be a bit of a shorter cross-country phase as well. So the Sydney Olympics, which were run at full length, that was the last really sort of epic cross-country day in the history of the sport. Badminton and all other high-level competitions realised that they were going to have to follow suit, because it wasn't much point preparing horses for the Olympics if, with a completely different competition. It was a completely different sort of horse. So, and no rider was going to take their horse to Badminton or any of the other top 3-day events where this very long endurance day was, if they didn't need to do that at an Olympic Games. And so all other championships and events followed suit. So that was the seismic change. Many people were very upset about this. They feared that people would not get their horses fit enough. I don't think that has necessarily been the case, but there certainly did have to be an adjustment. And many of today's generation of riders have never sort of known that level of preparation and fitness and organisation of the old days. But it has to be said that those phases are probably not much missed. Not many spectators went out to watch the steeplechase or the roads and tracks. And it has meant that horses have been able to have longer careers, and they have been able to do more competitions in a season now that they are not doing these sort of very long days. So it has worked out. It has worked out fine, but I think many people still feel that the overall Olympic concept has been diminished by that change. Nonetheless, been many enormously exciting competitions. It's still pretty difficult to win badminton. It's still difficult enough to get a horse there in the first place. Many people who compete in the sport never get anywhere near it. So it's still an enormous achievement. And my goodness, the person who wins always thoroughly deserves it. There are no duff winners ever.
Well, this brings us nicely to the other 5-star eventing. Was it 4 in America? 1 in France?
There are 7 in the world now, and 2 of them are in America. 1 is in Australia, 1 is in Germany, 1 is in France, and Britain is the only country that has 2, Badminton and Burghley. Burghley takes place in September. Burghley's been going since 1961. So badminton is still the senior event in terms of longevity and prize money and just fame, really. But yes, certainly it has perhaps diluted the sport at the very top level. But it's great, really, that there's plenty of other chances, and these events all carry tremendous prestige. Back in a few years ago, it was decided that the star ratings for all the competitions was going to change, and that badminton would be, along with the other events of its level, would be deemed 5-star. And it just sounded a bit more exciting. And it was also recognition that it is the pinnacle of the sport. And although the Olympics is the pinnacle in a different sort of way, the difficulty element of the cross-country is 4-star level at Olympics and championships. So badminton and the other competitions of their level, they remain the jewels in the crown. They remain the ones to aim for, and that is what gives them their edge and their specialness.
Okay, so just to round this off with my little geeky questions, because I did promise that I'd ask one or two. It's a two-part question, and I'd like to just know, because I'm going to ask Beth as well. I'd just like to know, one, what was always your dream horse forever? It could be as fictional as you want it to be, or as impractical as you want it to be. And then second of all, your favourite horse now.
Back in 2001, I was very lucky to be sent over to New Zealand to do a how-to training series with Mark Todd. He had just retired for the first time the year before, and he asked me if I would like to have a ride on Charisma. Now, Charisma was his double Olympic gold medalist, a really characterful little black horse. And Charisma he was nearly 30, I think, then. And I got on, my feet couldn't reach Mark's stirrup length. So they had to be completely sort of hitched up, and I still couldn't reach even when they were hitched up. But this old horse, there was this incredible power underneath you. In fact, I thought he was going to butt me off. And it was just quite extraordinary. And you realised, sitting on him, why he had been such a special horse and so successful. And it was rather lovely because he and Mark had an incredible bond, and the horse used to sort of trot round him like a dog following him. It was lovely. So he was the great eventing horse. I mean, there have been many. There's too many to mention. Other great badminton horses have included Anneli Drummond-Hayes' Amelia Monarch, which is before my time, but legendary of the day. Mary Gordon-Watson's horse, Cornishman V, who was also a completely fantastic horse. So those are the great horses of the past. Today, my favourite horse is last year's winner, Ros Cantor's Lordship's Gruffalo. He's known as Walter at home. And there's just something absolutely delightful about his demeanour. He's got he's a bay horse with a bit of a mealy nose, and he's just got a charming face, and he's so alert, and he just appears to be absolutely loving it. And she gets him beautifully fit, and he's wonderfully obedient. Ros is a tiny person, and she has such a great relationship with her horses. Despite her small size, she has this wonderful harmony with them. She doesn't need to ride with strength. She just rides them in this wonderful partnership. And yes, so he's my favourite horse of the moment.
Beth, have you got any favourite horses?
I mean, usually I'm very good at remembering animal names, but I'm not getting a particular horse come to mind. So I'll just say of a rider I've seen before. I definitely remember watching Charlotte Dujardin at the Olympics a few times doing the dressage. So I don't know what her horses' names have been, but I enjoyed those performances.
Well, Charlotte trains many event riders in the dressage phase. So she has involvement in the sport of horse trials, as does Carl Hester, her teammate, and he is a regular commentator on the dressage phase, and many riders go to both of them for training. And they have definitely inspired higher standards in the dressage phase as part of the 3-day event competition. They've definitely inspired a higher standard.
I'm just a lowly girl who likes to go for a hack. So that's what brings me joy. I was never good at competitions at all. I always dreamed of having a Palomino, which is completely impractical for myself. But now I'm probably going to look at going for a nice little Silesian. They're hardcore horses who just basically want to hack away, and they're not scared of anything, which makes them fantastic little hack horses. So quite exciting.
Oh, well, this has been a great brief tour through the Badminton Horse Trials, and clearly, Alina, you've enjoyed this as well with your horsey experience. So we've had a great time, Kate. Thank you. Where, for listeners who'd like to find out more, where can they find your books and more of your writing on equestrian history?
Well, this new book, Badminton at 75, will be on sale at Badminton in some of the stands there. The Horse Trials takes place from May 5th to 8th. Tickets have to be bought in advance, so get onto the website now. And the book will also be for sale in all good bookshops and online. And I'm delighted with it. It's got loads of wonderful pictures, many of them taken by Kit Houghton, who is a long-time equestrian photographer who worked with me on the book and on many other projects. And I also have another book out, which is about the history of Country Life magazine, 125 years of that. And that is also on sale at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kate, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.